EPR Creations. It's in the studio. From the EPR Creation Studio, this is Doc Staples bringing you Unconquered with Doc Staples. As always, this podcast brought to you by EPR Creations, by Louis Marquez and Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida, Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida, and Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage. If you're in Alabama, Tennessee, or Kentucky, or Florida, and you want the best in mortgage loan origination, if you're thinking about buying a house or any sort of real estate, Justin Galloway is the guy to talk to. Let him know you heard about him from the Unconquered podcast. Good time to start looking at property right now. You know, the rates are going to be coming down here pretty soon, and prices actually have dipped a good bit, largely because of those rates. And frankly, if you're thinking about it, buying at a lower price because the rates have been high, and then, you know, maybe being able to refinance in a few years, again with Justin Galloway, would be the way I would go. So not the worst thing in the world. But anyway, that's, you know, if you're in the market. So we are back to talk about another position preview. We're here talking about the wide receiver position. And frankly, I mentioned in the first two previews, the offensive line and the running backs previews, that those are going to be the position groups that essentially define the identity of this offense. One of the things I really like about the Mike Norvell offense is Norvell, in any given year, his offense is going to have a distinct identity. Now, last year's offense was the closest to not having a true identity of any offense that I think Norvell has coached in quite a while. And it's because they had some weaknesses that kind of kept them from being able to do some of the things they wanted to do best. And also getting banged up at key positions also was a major factor. But he has a distinct thing he wants to do with any specific offense that's going to be sort of the starting point. We're going to be good at this. And then everything's going to come off of that. Well, what we talked about in the first couple previews is what they're going to commit to being good at. And that is running the football between the tackles, pounding the rock. This is going to be one of those teams that is going to pound the rock. They're going to basically try to run the football down your throat. And if they can do that, they're going to keep doing it. There's not much reason to stop. They're going to lean on you, and they're going to try to bully you. That's what this team wants to be. Now, the thing about that is, in order to do what you want to do, in order to be able to have long-term success in football, this is one of the things that makes football such a great game, is the chess match, in that, okay, if that's what I know you want to do, if that's what you're going to hang your hat on, now that's what I, as a defense, am going to sell out to prevent you from doing. And that's where having the counter to your opponent's response is the critical thing. You've got to have things in your offense that are constraints, that prevent the defense from being able to key in on what your primary identity is. So you have to be able to do two or three other things to offset what the offense or what the defense is going to try to take away. So if you think about this in terms of individual players, think about this as in the context of, say, an edge rusher. Let's say you have an edge rusher who is a great bull rusher, or even better, a great speed rusher, just has elite speed around the edge. That's a great trick, right? Might be a one-trick pony, but it's a pretty good trick. But once it's clear that that guy just has one thing, and that's just sprinting upfield and getting around the corner and getting to the edge, it starts to get easier for offensive tackles to say, okay, I'm just going to really get a deep kick, set, and just run that guy around the edge. So if you're an elite speed rusher, you have to have one other thing, at least one other thing that you can do that's going to cause that offensive tackle problems, right? So let's say you've got an elite speed rush. Now, if you can pair that with a plus level spin move or some sort of counter, or speed to power if you've got a little bit more size. You know, what we saw with Jared Verse, where he'd just get up under the pads of the offensive tackle and run him right into the quarterback. Speed to power, or some sort of, you know, crossover inside rush move. If you pair it with that, that is going to constrain the offensive tackle so that if they start to overset against your speed, all of a sudden you've crossed them over and you're on the quarterback with your counter. It works the same way with an offense. And so I think Florida State's one identity, their one trick is going to be pretty good this year. They're going to be able to run the football. And this is a team that's going to be able to run the football against a lot of teams. But the better teams are going to make it hard for them to do that. So that's when you have to have the ability to counter. And that's where the passing game comes in. And to me, the floor of this ceiling, or the floor of this team is set pretty high because of where they are in terms of quality and depth on the offensive line and the quality and depth in the running back room. They're going to be able to run the football against almost everybody. And they're going to be able to run well enough to be pretty solid there. The ceiling of this team, I think you can make a strong case that the offensive ceiling is set by the wide receiver group. If the wide receivers take the step forward that they need to take, now this team goes from being, you know, maybe a 2-loss type team that has a chance to get an ACC title and an auto bid there, or maybe a 2-loss team that gets an at-large bid, or a 1-loss team that gets an at-large bid after not making the conference title game. Somewhere in there, you know, where you're a 10-win team and, you know, with a chance to maybe win the conference. Somewhere in there, that's kind of what where your expectation for this team is. If you see a couple wide receivers step up and become dudes who consistently play at a high level, that raises the ceiling of this team to now competitive to actually win a game in the playoff or more, to actually threaten for much more, to be able to potentially, you know, have an outside shot of going undefeated in your conference. There's a variety of things where, to me, it's this position group where you've got all those questions, and it's going to be a matter of how far can this position group take them? Because we'll talk about this in a couple previews. I think the quarterback position is going to be fine. I think DJ Uiagalelei is going to be better at the quarterback position than virtually anybody thinks. I think he's going to be really solid. The question is, are the wide receivers going to match the level of play that you're going to get from DJ? And, you know, DJ has some limitations. We'll talk about that. But they've built around what they're going to be in terms of identity really well, and with what they have in terms of what these receivers bring to the table. So let's get to it. So first of all, last year, let's look at, as we've done so far, what have you lost? Last year, you lost essentially a first-round wide receiver in Keon Coleman. Now, I think he was first pick of the second round. Basically, call him a fringe first-rounder, one of the best receivers in the country. And then you lost a matchup nightmare in Johnny Wilson, who was consistently a get-out-of-jail-free card for Florida State offensively the last couple of years. He made things so much easier for Jordan Travis, especially since Travis was, you know, again, kind of a, you know, miss in the strike zone type thrower, not an elite locator of the football, a good thrower, but not a top end location guy. When you have those big wide receivers that create mismatches, it makes it a lot easier for that kind of quarterback. This year, you don't have that kind of player. You just don't have that dude. Last year, you had 2 number ones. This year, the question is, do you have one? Now, that said, last year going into the season, I asked the question, who's going to take the Pokey Wilson role? Because you got a couple big guys. You got those mismatches who are, you know, tough covers because of size and length and catch radius and ball skills and all that. But you don't have the guy that is just going to go over the top and run away. And that's something that Mike Norvell has always had in his offense as an important part of basically, again, providing constraints on the defense. We're going to make you have to cover over the top with an additional safety because of that guy just being able to run away. Right? Call it the Tyreek Hill factor. And Norvell's always had that component in his offense up until last year where they really didn't have that dude. And you could see at times last year's offense, as good as it was, and as good as those wide receivers were, there were times last year's offense looked like it was laboring. Like things rarely looked that easy for last year's offense. Even when Jordan Travis was healthy, that offense was never really felt like it got out of third gear. Only a few times last year did that offense really get into top gear. It was a really good third gear, maybe fourth gear, but they never hit fifth gear. Now, what they did to try to solve that problem after the season is they went out and they grabbed a couple of guys that are top-end speed guys. Malik Benson, who is the fastest guy on this football team. And, there's been debates about this. You see these, folks on social media, who's the fastest guy on the Florida State team? I'm telling you right now, just look at the track times. It's Malik Benson. I mean, I talked last show about how fast Mekhi Danzy is. Danzy ran sub 10.6 with a roughly 2 mile an hour wind. That's that's real fast. Malik Benson ran 10.4. 10.44. He also ran 10.55. That's real fast. So at least in terms of top end speed that guys have put up in the past, Malik Benson's the fastest guy on this team. Now maybe Danzy's a little closer to his track days, so he might be right there. But those two guys are faster than anybody else on this team. And so now you've got in Benson a guy who, in terms of the size, in terms of the get up and go, Malik Benson is your Pokey Wilson role. He's your number two. He's the flanker role, the Z role, or the number two position, and he's your number one wide receiver. He's the guy that they brought in to be the number one wide receiver, and he's got to be that. 6'1", roughly 200 pounds, with that get up and go. To me, I've watched him catch the football. He's a natural catcher of the football. Now, he had some drops at Alabama. He's had a few at Florida State. The consistency is not quite where you'd like it. But I think he can actually be a number one for this team. And specifically a number one who is a downfield threat. I think Malik Benson can be for Florida State this year everything that Tez Walker was for North Carolina last year. And if you watched North Carolina with and without Tez Walker, it was a big difference. But Tez Walker, guy who ran 4.3 at the NFL Combine, about 6'2.5", he was a guy that basically changed their offense because he provided that stretch. A couple touchdowns against Miami, major problems because he just ran away from people. And I think Benson can provide that for Florida State. Just for reference, Tez Walker last year, very similar type of wide receiver, 8 games, 41 catches, 699 yards, 17 yards per catch, 7 touchdowns. I think, so you prorate that over 12 games, that's just over 1,000 yards receiving and about 10, 11 touchdowns. And look, if Florida State gets something like that out of Benson this year, which I think is in the cards, I think that's about what they could get, then this team suddenly has a much higher ceiling than what you think. Now, I don't think he'll quite get to 1,000 yards because I think they're going to rotate more, but it's that level of production when he's on the field that I think you're going to get. Maybe 750, 800 yards from Malik Benson would be outstanding. And he's got to be that guy. He's got to be the guy that sets the table for everybody else. And that's the thing. In college football, if you have a true number one who essentially demands help, everybody else on your offense gets better. This is why if you're looking at building a top-end college football team, you put your primary resources, we've talked about this for years, you put your primary resources at specific high-value positions. Number 1 is quarterback. Number 2 is defensive tackle. To a lesser extent, defensive end. But number 2 is defensive tackle. And then you can kind of put 4 and 5 together. You're 3, 4, and 5 together. It's wide receiver, defensive end, and corner. If you have on your offense, if you have limited resources, you put your primary resources into quarterback and at least one number 1 wide receiver. And on defense, you shore up your defensive tackles and have top-end corners. Look at what Clemson did for a number of years. Defensive line, top-end defensive tackle talent, elite quarterback play, and then, a series of number 1 wide receivers of Nuke Hopkins, Sammy Watkins, all the way down the list, T. Higgins. And those teams, look, they weren't that great on the offensive line through those seasons. Yeah, they had good backs most of those years. But they were awesome on the defensive line, at quarterback, wide receiver, and they had some top-end corners. Linebacker, you can be pretty good. Safety, you can have smart players that are there. Have a good slot receiver who will help you. But if you have a number 1 at wide receiver, it makes your whole offense better. Question is, can Malik Benson be that? After him, to me, you're looking at 2 guys at that 9 position, at the traditional X position, and that's Kentron Poitier and Hakeem Williams. Those guys are basically splitting that role. Ideally, you'd like Hakeem Williams to kind of take that step up to be the guy there, because he's the most talented of your big-bodied wide receivers on this roster. Although Elijah Moore is going to have something to say about that before too long. But, Moore, again, don't expect anything from, and I'll just say this before we get any further. Don't expect a whole lot from LaWayne McCoy, Elijah Moore, BJ Gibson, Camden Fryer. Those guys, they're playing a position. It is just not built for young guys to be able to do a whole lot there. And if you have young guys that are doing a lot at your wide receiver position, it usually means either that you just don't have much talent at that spot otherwise, or you've got a Julio Jones or, Calvin Ridley type. And those guys are extremely rare. Even your 5 stars usually take 2-3 years to really blossom. It's one of the reasons why this is such a hard position to recruit. One of the things that I will say in Mike Norvell's favor is that he has tended to recruit receivers rather than just athletes at the position. You look at a guy like LaWayne McCoy or an Elijah Moore or a Camden Fryer or a BJ Gibson, all of those guys came in more prepared to play wide receiver at the college level than most. Now, Hakeem Williams was more of a raw player. You take that guy. But he was more of a raw player coming out. But Norvell takes fewer of those raw guys and more wide receiver types coming out than, say, a Jimbo Fisher did. So a guy like McCoy or Moore or Gibson, Fryer, those are guys that are going to be ready in year 2 rather than in year 3 or 4, generally. That's normally how that works. So moving back to the guys that are going to play more, Poitier and Williams, essentially what you're asking for from them is, can they win one-on-ones against tight coverage on the boundary? Can they win your back shoulder plays? Can they fight for tough yardage? Can they get the tough yardage when teams are going to go one-on-one? Can they force teams on the boundary not to be able to just one-on-one cover with their number 1 corner? So if Malik Benson is kind of your 1A and he's got to be your number 1 receiver, in some sense, you want Williams and Poitier to be a 1B at that 9 spot. They're not going to be a Johnny Wilson, but can they be 75% of what Johnny Wilson was? Now, Williams has much more big play potential in terms of once he gets his hands on the football, on screens, that sort of thing. He's a freak. So if things actually start to get more consistent for him, now all of a sudden, again, you're raising the ceiling of this team, because if Hakeem Williams, if he gets it, I talked about this on the running back show. There are certain guys on this roster that you game plan to get the football in their hands, because the scoreboard changes when they touch it, right? I talked about Jalen Lucas. He might not play a bunch on offense, but you try to get the ball in his hands 3 or 4 times a game, because one of those times he might just take it to the house. Malik Benson is a guy, because of that long speed, you know that, say, 3 times a game, you're calling a shot play to get that guy some sort of matchup where he can run away. That's what you're trying to do. Can you get, some sort of post climb, your post with a deep over, to try to isolate Malik Benson on a safety so that your big armed quarterback can just throw it up and let that guy go and run under it, because it's, the corner's going to have a hard time tracking him. You know that you align this way, they're going to probably align in quarters. Now you're going to have an alert post, throw it over the top, and just let Benson run away from a corner. You're going to try to do that 3 or 4 times a game, because that changes the scoreboard. You hit 2 of them, and you score 14 points. Jalen Lucas, like I said, you get the ball in his hands 3, 4 times, you might get 1 touchdown out of that, right? Lawrence Toafili, you know that you're trying to get 3 or 4 plays where you get him the ball on the edge, or you get a rail route or a wheel route or something there where you're getting the ball in his hands in a specific context, because the scoreboard changes. You know that in certain contexts, you want him to be in the direct snap, because he can do some things there that change things for the offense. Right? The question is, Hakeem Williams has the capacity to become one of those guys. If he gets consistent enough to where you can really trust him, now you start to say, okay, that guy, I want to try to have 2 or 3 things per game where I'm getting the ball in his hands, because he breaks 1 tackle and goes. Does he become that? Right now, I would bet on that being next year rather than this year, but it's, the light bulb is flickering. And I think Poitier, as long as he stays healthy, becomes your kind of consistency option at that spot. So you're in pretty good shape there. But again, the real ceiling, the place where you might hit your ceiling here, is what happens when, and we saw this in the postseason exhibition game, what happens when you go against a team that has elite corners? What happens when you go against a team that has a top-end secondary where they're used to playing one-on-one? Can they take away your wide receivers with their one-on-ones and tee off on your running game with their safeties? That's the question. Are we at a spot where a Hakeem Williams or a Malik Benson or a Kentron Poitier can step in and be like, look, if you're going to cover me one-on-one, you're going to have some serious problems? That's where the ceiling of this team gets determined. Other guys in this mix, Ja'Kai Douglas from the slot has made a number of big plays in his Florida State career. You look at last year's Pitt game, you look at the Miami game a couple of years ago. Reliable player, and a guy who, again, sub 11 second in the 100-meter track time. He can run away from you. And again, against certain teams, Ja'Kai Douglas becomes one of those guys where you say, let's get 2 or 3 plays where we know we're going to get a one-on-one here and he can run away. We know we can get a slot fade against this coverage where they're not going to have safety help and he can run away. So maybe you, again, against certain teams, he becomes one of those guys that you scheme something up for. And I think he's your starting slot. I think that makes sense there. When you're not in 21 personnel or 20 or 12 personnel. And then you got the other guys that I think are likely to play, and get significant snaps. You've got Darian Williamson, another senior who has struggled to stay healthy at times, but when he's been healthy, has flashed. Big body, another guy that, he offers the bigger body type at that Z position behind Benson. And then Jaylen Brown, who not quite as fast as Benson, but sub 10.6. He's in the mix with Mekhi Danzy and Benson. If you're going to have a 4x100 team, those 3 guys are on it. It's probably Benson, Benson, Brown, Jalen Lucas, and Danzy are your probable 4x100. Do Span just off as an alternate, maybe a guy that you have running in the prelims. But that's your 4x100 there. And Jalen Brown is one of those guys that, again, in the mix for some reps, and another guy that, maybe you stick in the slot at times because he can run away. And then, again, Do Span, he's a guy that I was really excited about when they signed him because of the upside. And I mentioned, look, you got a first round ceiling here. And I made it clear, this is ceiling because this is a guy that played quarterback in high school. He's got to learn how to play the position. He's got to gain he's got to gain the consistency to play this position, but give him 2 years and he could be wide receiver 1. And that never really happened, but still a guy that, you can use and can be a useful player at times, but really more of a backup, more of a spot player at this point. So the good thing is that you feel like you've got, that's 4, 5, 6, 7 wide receivers that you can trust. The real question is, how high is the high end for the highest end players here? And to me, the guys that have the highest end of the players who are going to play this year, it's Benson, Hakeem Williams, and Jalen Brown. We'll see who steps up and really becomes that guy. And we're also going to find out what happens when you play a Clemson, Notre Dame, those teams that have the better corners. What happens? Are these guys going to be able to make the plays in those contexts? Because last year's Clemson game, the difference in that game, Johnny Wilson won a couple of downfield one-on-ones that were critical in key positions. And ultimately, when the game was on the line, they went to Keon Coleman, and Coleman mossed a guy. That's the difference in that game. Without those guys making those plays on the edge, they lose that football game. To beat Clemson this year, you're going to need Malik Benson or Hakeem Williams or Kentron Poitier or Ja'Kai Douglas. One of those guys is going to need to run away and make a play downfield. I don't think you're going to see as much, back shoulder throw up to the outside type stuff this year as you did last year. You're going to see some of that to Poitier and Williams, a little bit of that to Williamson when he's on the field, but that's less of an emphasis with this. You're going to see more guys trying to get shots down the field and getting guys the ball moving in space to use that speed. But they're going to need to find ways to get some of those downfield plays, because you do that twice against the Clemson, and now all of a sudden they have to honor that. And they know they have to honor that. And now you're able to run the foot. That loosens up the run game. Now you've got the balance to be able to beat those top-end defenses. This is where, to me, the ceiling of this team is determined right here. The floor is set everywhere else. The ceiling basically boils down to the wide receivers. I'm a little bit bullish on the fact that they've got enough speed from enough places that they'll be able to find something, but the proof of the pudding is in the eating. We'll find out. Till then, this has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. I'm your host, Doc Staples. Thanks for listening. If you've been enjoying this podcast, please leave a 5-star rating over at Apple Podcasts and wherever else you listen to podcasts. Post and repost episodes on social media, and tell a friend. And if you haven't left a review in a while, do it again. It really does help the visibility of the podcast. Before we go, I'd also like to thank my advertising partners once more. That's EPR Creations, Louis Marquez of Keller Williams Realty in Jacksonville, Florida, Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida, and Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, and Kentucky. You can also stop by the Unconquered Shop at unconqueredpodcast.com, where you can buy stickers, pins, magnets, t-shirts, and other swag. And thanks also to all those supporters over at Patreon, where I post video analysis and field questions for the podcast. I am especially grateful to those above the dynasty level. That is Andrew Garrett, Brian Leininger, Neil Cook, Casey Kidd, Chris Chartrand, Dave Blair, Hector Cartagena, Jack Horton, Jimmy Van, Jonathan Kennedy, Keith Cheney, Lee Caswell, Tyler Kashishke, Vince Calandra, and Bert Bertoldi. You all are far more generous than I deserve. I'm really grateful. Thanks to you all. This has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. I'm your host, Jason Staples. Thanks for listening and thanks for your support. I made this.